Don't let her be in the photos. She said it so smoothly to the wedding planner. You'd think she was talking about centerpieces or the shade of ribbon on the programs, not her own mother. I was standing a few feet away, holding a lint roller in one hand and a spare pair of flats in the other, the kind of things mothers carry in purses, too big for their bodies, along with crumpled tissues, breath mints, and silent hopes that this day would somehow validate 21 years of sacrifice. When the words reached my ears, something strange happened. My hearing went muffled, like I was underwater, and my heart took over all the functions my brain had abandoned. It started beating so loud I was sure everyone in that pristine white tent could hear it, a drum announcing my erasure. I'm not a dramatic person. I've never been the type to make scenes or demand attention. I'm the kind who labels freezer bags with dates and contents in neat block letters, who keeps umbrellas by every door because you never know when the sky might turn, who buys extra napkins at the grocery store just in case we run out, because running out of things feels like failure. I'm the kind of person who plans for disaster by preparing for small inconveniences. The wedding was at a restored barn outside Frederick, Maryland, the kind of place that charged extra for rustic charm and authentic atmosphere. Fairy lights were strung between wooden beams like captured stars. Wildflowers in various stages of bloom sat in mason jars wrapped with twine and burlap. Everything was perfectly imperfect, curated casualness that cost more than my first car. It smelled like fresh-cut grass, expensive perfume, and hope, that particular scent of beginnings that makes you forget all the endings that came before. My daughter Harper was beautiful. She's always been beautiful, even as a colicky infant with her face red from crying, even as a gangly preteen with braces and bad bangs. I cut myself to save money. But that day, she was transcendent. She looked like someone who believed life would keep its promises, like someone who had never learned that sometimes love asks you to disappear, and maybe it would keep its promises for her. Maybe I had absorbed all the broken promises so hers could stay whole. But that day, when she turned to the Planora clipboard-wielding woman named Simone with a headset and an efficiency that bordered on military and said, "No pictures with her, please," I realized something inside me had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before something shatters, the kind of quiet that lives in the eye of a hurricane. I had spent 21 years stepping back, giving space, being careful not to take the spotlight or cast shadows that were too long. I did it out of love, or what I thought love was supposed to be. You make yourself small so your child can grow tall. You say yes, even when yes tastes like blood in your mouth. You swallow hard and smile and pretend that disappearing from the picture literally and otherwise is a choice you're making freely, not one being made for you. The thing about making yourself small is that eventually, people start to believe that's your actual size. They forget you were ever larger. They forget you had edges and opinions and needs that didn't revolve around their comfort. When the photographer arrived, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and an expensive camera, Harper smiled at her with that bride smile that belongs to magazines and Pinterest boards. "Please make sure she isn't in any shots," she said, gesturing vaguely in my direction without actually looking at me. The photographer nodded, professional and detached, the way people are when they're witnessing someone else's family dysfunction and getting paid to pretend they don't see it. I looked down at my hands, suddenly fascinated by the way my knuckles had started to show age spots I didn't remember acquiring. I pretended to fix the strap of my shoe, which wasn't broken. It was just something to do with my hands, something that looked purposeful when purpose had abandoned me entirely. My sister, Jill, was suddenly beside me. She has this way of appearing exactly when I need her, like she's been watching for cracks in my facade her whole life. "Breathe," she whispered, her hand on my elbow, steady and warm. "You don't have to vanish for her anymore. You've done enough vanishing." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to stand up straight and demand to be seen, to be included, to matter in the most important day of my daughter's life. But old habits are hard to kill. They're harder than cockroaches, harder than weeds, harder than hope. They burrow into your bones and make homes there. And evicting them requires a violence you're not sure you're capable of. The ceremony was beautiful in the way expensive things often are, perfect and cold and slightly untouchable. Everyone stood when Harper appeared at the entrance of the barn, backlit by late afternoon sun, looking like an angel descending. Everyone except me. I stayed seated in the back row, partially hidden behind a post that smelled like old wood and varnish. Daniel, my ex-husband, was up front in the place of honor, tall and proud in his custom suit. Beside him stood Allison, his wife of 8 years, with her yoga-sculpted body and her base smooth skin that had never known a day of real worry. They were the ones who got to stand up there. They were the ones in the family photos that had been taken before the ceremony, the ones I wasn't invited to, the perfect picture, the perfect family, the one that erased me so completely you'd never know I'd existed at all. I stayed seated because sometimes sitting is the only dignity left when standing has been taken from you. Because sometimes the only power you have is the power to witness, even if you're witnessing your own erasure. The vows were full of soft words about home and forever, about being each other's safe harbor and chosen family. Harper's voice trembled with emotion when she promised to love Brian through all the seasons of life. I watched in silence, my hands folded in my lap like I was praying, trying not to cry, trying to identify whether the burning in my chest was pride or grief or some terrible combination of both. I wasn't sure anymore if I was crying for her happiness or for everything I had erased of myself so she could have it, for all the pieces of me I'd given away like borrowed cups that were never returned, for the woman I'd been before motherhood taught me that love sometimes means making yourself invisible. During the cocktail hour, people laughed and toasted with champagne that cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries for a week. The photographer moved through the crowd like a dancer, arranging family groups with the precision of someone building a house of cards. Each grouping was carefully constructed to tell a specific story, and I was not part of that narrative. "Bride with mom and dad," she called out, and my entire body tensed. Daniel and Allison stepped forward like they were born for this moment, like they'd rehearsed it in front of mirrors. Daniel's hand found the small of Allison's back with practiced ease. Harper moved between them, radiant and belonging. The word mom echoed through me like thunder rolling through an empty house, each syllable a small detonation. I stood by the lemonade table, pretending to read the ingredients label: sugar, water, lemon juice, love, trying to look occupied, trying to look like someone who had chosen to be alone rather than someone who had been chosen against. Harper caught my eye for just a second, and I saw something flicker there. Guilt, maybe, or recognition, or nothing at all. Maybe I was projecting meaning onto a glance that meant nothing more than passing acknowledgement. Then she turned to the photographer and said again, softly but firmly enough that I heard it across the crowded space, "Keep her out." Something broke, not loudly. There was no dramatic crash, no shattering glass, but definitively. Maybe it was small, like a blood vessel in the heart, releasing its contents into places blood shouldn't go. Maybe it had been breaking all along, one microscopic fracture at a time, and this was just the moment I finally noticed. Either way, the sound reached me, silent and deafening all at once. I thought about leaving. I actually mapped out the route in my mind, past the bar, through the side door, across the gravel parking lot to my car. I could be home in 45 minutes. I could take off this dress that cost too much and made me feel like I was playing dress up in someone else's life. I could pour a glass of wine and pretend this day never happened. But then I thought about Jill's words, about all the vanishing I'd done, about how I'd spent 2 decades being quiet when quiet was killing me. When it was time for speeches, I walked to the DJ booth with purpose I'd forgotten I possessed. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, someone braver. The DJ was a kid in his 20s with headphones around his neck and the slightly bored expression of someone who'd seen 1,000 wedding receptions blur together into one endless celebration of other people's happiness. 5 minutes, I said. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me. No music, just me. He looked at me, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. He could tell it mattered. He could tell this wasn't a planned speech about how beautiful the bride looked or how the happy couple met at a coffee shop and it was destiny. "You got it," he said, and handed me the microphone. They let me take it because I said the magic words, "mother of the bride." Nobody checked if that designation was still true, if it had ever been true, if truth was even something that mattered in a world of curated Instagram moments and families built on carefully maintained fictions. I walked to the front of the reception area. The band had been playing something upbeat and forgettable. Now there was just silence and the sound of my shoes on the wooden floor. Step, an announcement, a declaration, a small act of war. "Good evening," I began. Faces turned toward me. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Harper's smile froze on her face like someone had pressed pause on a video. Daniel's jaw tightened in that way. It used to when I'd done something that embarrassed him, which was often because existing embarrassed him. Allison's hand moved to her chest in what might have been concern, or might have been the calculation of how this would affect her carefully maintained image. I looked at my daughter. She was radiant even in her confusion, even in her sudden fear. She looked like the future I used to pray for when I was working 3 jobs and wondering if I'd live to see her graduate high school, much less get married. When I was so tired I'd fall asleep standing up doing dishes, dreaming of a day when she'd be happy and whole and free from all the darkness I'd shielded her from. I'll be brief, I continued, which was a lie. I had 21 years of things to say. I have kept a secret for 21 years. I kept it because I wanted to protect you. I wanted your life to be simple, because children deserve simple stories. They deserve fairy tales, with clear heroes and villains, not the messy truth where everyone is both and neither. But the truth I hid has been burning a hole in me since the day you were born, and today, when you asked to erase me from the pictures, I realized that protecting you has cost me myself. The room was so quiet, I could hear someone's watch ticking 3 tables away. When you came into this world, everything was chaos. There were papers that needed signing, courts that needed convincing, and fear, so much fear it was hard to breathe through it. There was a man who wanted to own, not love, who believed that fatherhood was about possession rather than protection. There was a young woman, barely more than a girl herself, too sick and too lost and too broken to raise a child, who knew the most loving thing she could do was let go. And there was me, standing in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning with a pen in my hand that shook so hard I could barely sign my name, signing where the yellow tabs told me to sign, making promises I wasn't sure I could keep, but knew I had to try. And there was you, sleeping in a plastic hospital crib, your little fists clenched like you were already fighting, unaware that everything was changing, unaware that your entire world was being rebuilt by people who hoped they were doing the right thing. I paused. Harper's face had gone completely white. I am not your biological mother. The air left the room. Someone gasped. Several people looked at Daniel, whose face had turned the color of old concrete. Allison's mouth fell open. Harper stared at me like I'd just reached into her chest and rearranged her organs. I am your mother because I chose you, I continued, my voice stronger now, because I held you when nobody else would. When you had colic so bad you screamed for 6 hours straight and I walked circles around our tiny apartment until my feet bled because you'd only sleep if I was moving. Because I worked 3 jobs cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during lunch, doing data entry from home whenever you napped in. I sold my wedding ring to keep the heat on during that terrible winter when the pipes froze and I thought we might not make it. Because I left a man who wanted obedience more than honesty, who thought a wife should be seen and not heard, who thought children were accessories to a successful life rather than entire universes, requiring love and attention and sacrifice. Because I learned to make a home out of borrowed furniture and thrift store finds and faith that somehow we'd be okay even when the bank account said otherwise. Because I loved you every single day, even when I was too tired to say it out loud. Even when I fell asleep while reading you bedtime stories and woke up hours later with the book pressed against my face and you curled against my side. Even when you were a teenager and told me you hated me because I wouldn't let you go to a party where I knew there'd be things that could hurt you. Even when loving you meant letting you hate me. I did not tell you because I wanted to keep you safe. The people who might have used this truth against us were still alive. Back then, your biological father had family who had threatened to take you, to drag us through courts and investigations and questions I didn't have good answers for. And I didn't want you to see yourself as someone's mistake. You were never a mistake. You were my miracle. You were the thing that saved me from a life that was killing me slowly. Daniel shifted in his chair. His face was unreadable now, shut down in that way he'd perfected during our marriage, the way that said he was feeling too much and showing nothing. Allison's hand fell from his arm like a bird shot out of the sky. 21 years ago, I promised your birth mother that you would be safe. She was 17 years old, just a kid herself. She placed you in my arms. You were 6 days old, and you smelled like hospital soap and possibility, and she said she'd be better off with you. Her voice broke on every word. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe, and I promised her. I looked her in the eyes and I promised that I would love you and protect you and give you every opportunity I could find or make or steal if necessary. I kept that promise every day since, through every scraped knee and broken heart and failed test and teenage argument, through every moment when I wondered if I was doing it right, if I was enough, if love alone could make up for all the things I couldn't give you. But today, when you said I shouldn't be in the photos, I realized that safety isn't always the same as silence, and that protecting you by erasing myself has taught you that I'm someone who can be erased. People were crying now. Not polite wedding tears, but the ugly kind that comes from somewhere deep and true. Jill was beside me when, had she moved there, her hand on my back, steady and strong. There was a fire the night you were born. The house where your birth mother lived caught fire. Old wiring in a building that should have been condemned years ago but wasn't, because landlords don't care about poor people's safety. I was there because I'd promised to check on her, to bring her groceries and make sure she was eating enough, taking care of herself through those final weeks of pregnancy. The smoke alarms didn't work. They'd been broken for months. Someone had called 911, but the fire trucks were still 5 minutes away, and 5 minutes is forever when fire is eating a building alive. I ran inside, which was stupid. Everyone told me later. Incredibly stupid, and I found her unconscious in the bathroom. She'd been getting ready for bed. I shook her awake, and she looked at me with these eyes that were already somewhere else, and she pointed to the bedroom. You were in a bassinet by the window. The smoke hadn't reached that room yet, but it was coming, black and thick and hungry. I grabbed you. You were already wrapped in that yellow blanket, the one I still have in my closet, the one I can't seem to throw away, and I carried your birth mother to the window. We went out through the bathroom window. It was small and high, and the glass cut me when I broke it because I didn't have time to be careful. That's how I got this scar. I pushed my hair aside, behind my left ear, where a thin white line ran from my temple to my ear, about 3 inches long, slightly raised. In certain lights you could barely see it, in others it looked like silver lightning. The scar was small, but it was proof of love that costs something, love that leaves a mark, love that isn't pretty or perfect or Instagram ready, but is real and raw and permanent. Your birth mother went to the hospital. You went with me. She held you one last time 3 days later, and then she signed the papers, and she walked away because she loved you enough to know she couldn't give you what you needed. And I've carried that story, her sacrifice and mine, in silence for 21 years. You asked not to see me in your pictures, but I was there in every frame of your life, even the ones you don't remember. I was behind the camera at your dance recitals and school plays, behind the curtain, sewing your Halloween costumes at midnight because you'd changed your mind about what you wanted to be, behind the door when boys broke your heart, waiting to see if you'd need me, or if you'd handle it yourself, making sure there was still a world for you to stand in, making sure you had ground beneath your feet solid enough to build a life on. When I finished speaking, the silence was total and absolute. You could have heard a pin drop, a heartbreak, a world shift on its axis. Then Harper stood. She didn't run or shout or collapse. She just stood up, slow and deliberate, like someone who'd just realized she'd been living in a house and never knew there was a whole other floor she'd never seen. She walked toward me across that barn floor. Her wedding dress rustled with each step. Her veil had come slightly loose and was hanging crooked, but she didn't fix it. She reached out and touched the scar with her fingertips. Her hands were shaking. Her makeup was already streaking down her face in dark rivers. I said not to include you, she whispered, and her voice was completely different, no younger, smaller, broken open, because I thought you'd make it about yourself. She was crying hard now, barely able to speak. I thought you'd be dramatic. I thought you'd try to steal attention. I didn't know. Her voice cracked completely. I didn't know the story. I didn't know you'd saved my life before I was even old enough to know I had one. You were right, I said, and I was crying too now. Both of us a mess in front of 200 people who'd come expecting a celebration and got a revelation instead. For 21 years I didn't make it about myself. I made it about you. Everything about you. Until I forgot I was allowed to exist too. Maybe I should have told you sooner. Maybe I should have made you see me. Maybe I should have taught you that love doesn't require erasure. She started to cry, harder, not the polite tears of a bride having a moment, but the deep, guttural sobs of someone whose entire foundation has shifted. I held her. She buried her face in my shoulder, and her body shook with it. The photographer had lowered her camera. The guests looked away or stared or cried themselves. It felt like the first real moment of the entire day. Maybe the first real moment we'd had in years. Brian, her new husband, stood uncertainly a few feet away, not sure if he should intervene or bear witness. Daniel was on his feet, his face working through emotions I couldn't name. Allison sat frozen, her perfect composure finally cracked. I'm sorry, Harper kept saying into my shoulder, over and over like an incantation. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Later, after the speeches resumed, Daniel gave his, awkward and stilted, about watching Harper grow up, conveniently leaving out that he'd missed most of it after the cake was cut and the first dance happened and people went back to drinking and laughing with that slightly manic energy that follows emotional explosions. Harper came to me again. I was standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching couples spin and sway, thinking about how strange it was that life just continued after moments that felt world-ending. Who is she? Harper asked quietly. She meant her birth mother. Where is she now? Is she? She couldn't finish the question. Alive, I said, sober. Last I heard, which was about 6 months ago. She's in Ohio, Toledo. She works at a grocery store. She got married 3 years ago to a good man. From what I can tell, I send postcards twice a year on your birthday and at Christmas. I tell her you're okay. I send photos when I have them. She never replies. But the postcards never come back either, so I know she's receiving them. Sometimes love means staying quiet. Sometimes it means witnessing from a distance. Sometimes it means respecting someone else's boundaries, even when it hurts. Harper nodded slowly, processing. Do you want me to meet her? She asked, and I could hear the fear underneath the question. Fear of what it would mean. Fear of what she'd find. Fear of disrupting the fragile peace we'd just barely achieved. I told her it wasn't about what I wanted anymore. It hadn't been about what I wanted for a long time, maybe ever. It was her life, her choice, her story to write however she needed to write it. I'd spent 21 years trying to write it for her, trying to protect her from the complicated parts, and look where that had gotten us. I don't know if I'm ready, she said softly. Then don't be ready, I told her. You don't have to decide tonight, or tomorrow, or ever. Some things can just exist without being resolved. Some questions don't need immediate answers. She leaned her head on my shoulder then, and we stood like that for a long time, watching her wedding reception happen around us like we were observers rather than participants, like we'd stepped slightly outside of time. That night, long after midnight, when most of the guests had left and the cleanup crew was breaking down tables, the photographer came to find me. I was behind the barn where the smokers had congregated earlier, looking at the stars and trying to remember who I'd been before I became someone's mother, someone's ex-wife, someone's ghost. She said her name was Reese. She had kind eyes and a small tattoo of a bird on her wrist. I grew up in foster care, she said without preamble, like she'd been carrying this story around and needed to set it down. In Ohio, Cleveland, I bounced around 12 different homes between age 4 and 18. Most of them were fine. Some weren't. But there was this volunteer who came through the system. She'd bring us things sock, because nobody ever thinks about socks and crayons and books from the library sale. She had a scar above her left ear. Not you, she added quickly, seeing my expression. But someone like you, someone who'd decided that love sometimes looks like showing up for strangers. She handed me a small envelope, the kind photographers use for contact sheets. I printed one picture early, she said, before I knew whether I was supposed to. It's you and Harper. No touch-ups, no edits, no filters or corrections, just the truth. I opened it with shaking hands. It was us, holding each other in the middle of the barn floor, her face buried in my shoulder, my hand cradling the back of her head, like she was small again, like she was that 6-day-old baby I'd carried through smoke and fear. You could see the mess of makeup and the tear tracks. You could see my scar catching the light. You could see the way we were holding on to each other like we were afraid of drowning, or like we'd just realized we'd been drowning for years and had finally found solid ground. Somehow, it was beautiful. Somehow, it was the truest thing I'd ever seen. It looked like forgiveness. It looked like beginning again. The next morning, Harper came to my house. It was early before 8 and I was still in my pajamas, drinking coffee and staring at the photo Reese had given me, trying to understand how pain and beauty could look so much alike. She had a grocery bag in her hands, one of those reusable ones, with a grocery store logo fading from too many washes. Can I come in? She asked, and I realized it might have been the first time she'd asked permission to enter my space in years. Usually she just walked in like she owned the place, which I'd encourage because I wanted her to feel like this was her home too, even after she'd moved out. Inside were pieces of her childhood, carefully curated drawings from elementary school, the one where she'd drawn our family as stick figures and I was the biggest one with the biggest smile. School papers with gold stars and teacher comments. Harper is such a joy to have in class. The receipt from her first car, a beat-up Honda Civic we'd bought together with money I'd saved for 3 years. A note I wrote her in 10th grade when she was going through something with friends and didn't want to talk about it. You are stronger than you know and more loved than you can imagine. I kept these, she said, and her voice was thick because I thought one day you might leave and I'd need proof that you were real, that this was real, that I hadn't imagined having a mother who actually cared. We sat on the kitchen floor. The tile was cold and hard, but we stayed there for hours anyway, like we were kids at a sleepover, like we had all the time in the world and nothing more important to do than be present with each other. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I told her everything. The real version, the messy version, the one where love isn't perfect but it's true, I told her about her birth mother whose name was Jennifer. I said, giving her that piece of information I'd held on to like a sacred thing, about how Jennifer had been in an abusive relationship and hadn't known she was pregnant until she was 5 months along, about how she'd tried to get clean but it was hard, so hard, and she kept relapsing, about how she'd loved Harper enough to know she couldn't be what Harper needed. I told her about the fire in more detail, how Jennifer had been unconscious from smoke inhalation, how I'd slapped her awake, how we'd crawled through rooms full of smoke that burned our lungs, how I'd thought we were all going to die, how breaking that window with my elbow had seemed like nothing compared to getting Harper out safely. I told her about the first night I spent alone with her, how I'd been terrified I was doing everything wrong, how she'd cried and I couldn't figure out why, how I'd finally just held her against my chest and cried too, and somehow that had soothed us both, how I'd promised her, even though she couldn't understand words yet, that I would figure it out, that I would be enough. I told her about Daniel, how he'd wanted to be a father in theory but not in practice, how he'd loved the idea of a family but hated the messy reality of it, how he'd wanted me to be quieter, smaller, more convenient, how leaving him had been the hardest and best thing I'd ever done. Harper asked questions I didn't have answers for. Does Jennifer think about me? I don't know. Maybe every day. Maybe she's tried to forget because remembering is too painful. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I was afraid you'd love me less. Because I was afraid you'd want her instead. Because I was afraid that the truth would take you away from me. Do you regret it? Adopting me? Never. Not for one single second. You saved my life as much as I saved yours. We looked up Jennifer together on my laptop, Harper's hand shaking so hard I had to type for her. We found a Facebook profile that might have been hurt. The privacy settings were high so we couldn't see much, but there was one public photo, a woman who looked like an older version of Harper, standing beside a golden retriever, smiling at the camera with Harper's exact same smile. The caption said, "New Beginnings." Harper stared at that photo for a long time, so long I thought she'd frozen. Finally she said quietly, "I don't know if I want to meet her." I told her she didn't have to decide that day. She could just let it be. She could hold the information and the possibility and not do anything with it until she was ready, if she was ever ready. Some doors don't need to be opened. Some can stay closed, and that's okay too. Are you angry at her? Harper asked. Jennifer? I thought about it. Really thought about it. No, I said finally. She gave me you. She made an impossible choice and she chose your life over her comfort. That's not something to be angry about. That's something to honor. When the wedding photos arrived 3 weeks later, a thick white box delivered by a courier, full of glossy prints and a USB drive with digital files, they were full of light. Harper and Brian cutting the cake, Harper and her bridesmaids laughing, Harper and her father, Daniel, in that stiff formal pose they'd managed, and Harper and me, in dozens of shots. Reese had apparently ignored Harper's initial instruction entirely. Once I'd given my speech, there we were, holding each other and crying, standing together at the edge of the dance floor, my hand on her cheek, her eyes closed, her head on my shoulder while people danced around us. In all of them, the same scar caught the same light, a small silver line that said, "I was here. I fought for this. I bled for this. I survived this. And I always will be."